Well, thanks everybody for joining me today. This is the first in our series of AI tool webinars that are sponsored by the Center for AI and the Liberal Arts. And in this one, I wanted to offer some introduction to deep research tools. And really, it's not just deep research, but some of the agentic capabilities that these platforms are offering, and to offer some suggestions on how you might be able to use it, some cautions, some concerns, and then be able to work through maybe some exercises where you're able to try this out for yourselves. This is, of course, sponsored by the Center for AI and the Liberal Arts, a brand new center here on campus, and I'm very excited about it. We have a lot planned for this semester and for the rest of the year as well. A series of these AI tool presentations. We have public debates in September and November on AI and the environment, and then AI and copyright, a guest speaker at the end of October, and that's just for the fall. We'll have a lot more planned for the rest of the school year, and I'll keep the webpage updated, and I'll show you that at the end where you can find more information. Now, for this session, what I was hoping to do is to say a little bit about, how deep research tools work. And excellent, I see in the chat a question about a definition of deep research. Yes, and we'll definitely get into that. I want to be able to outline a bit of the differences between a standard query on a chatbot and a deep research query. What does that mean? How does it actually work? And how would we define this? Talk a bit about error reduction as one of the reasons for developing tools like this and how that might compare to human error rates. Nothing definitive. It doesn't certainly close the door on this discussion, but it is something to get us to start to think a bit about how we use these tools and how we would compare them to some of our own practices or work that we might do on our own or have others do with us. Then I want to offer some comparison of research platforms and talk a bit about how deep research works or research tools work on some of these platforms, including Microsoft's Copilot. They have an agent they made available that we all have access to that I think is pretty robust and offers a lot of capabilities that we'll be able to play around with. Go through a demonstration and exercise with some different ideas, and then have some time for discussion about some concerns as well as some limitations that are very important to consider when we're thinking about any of the AI tools that we have. At any point, if there's a question, feel free to unmute and just jump in or put it in the chat, and we'll be able to talk about it. So thinking about, let me start with just how a standard chatbot would process a query that you might have. And we have some other experts in this discussion that are welcome to jump in, and computer scientists to jump in and give a better explanation about any of this. I think just as a thumbnail sketch of basically how it works. When you go to something like ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity or Copilot with just a standard question, really what happens is that it takes that language and it breaks it down into tokens. It analyzes the context and user intent. It decides whether to use internal memory or access other data through a search. And this is a newer development. Early ChatGPT in November 22 didn't have this capability. It really just relied on internal quote unquote memory because it's not recalling data. It's generating text and it's predictive text based on some of the training material that it had. But it's trying to represent some of that memory in the answer that it has. Then it starts to predict one token at a time to be able to develop the language response. It applies any grammatical rules and it converts that answer from tokens back into words. It happens very quickly, and we've become very accustomed to most of these chatbots being able to nearly instantaneously give us a response to a question that we might have, a query that we might have. And those of you that have been playing around with these tools for the last several years or even longer will see just the difference when you had a question that you might have posed to ChatGPT in 2022, and you would see it type out word for word, and now it's just hundreds of words at a time, and it's become faster and faster in terms of that kind of response. Now, that's very different than agentic AI, and in particular, the deep research tools that I wanted to talk a bit about. Now, when we talk about deep research, the language might vary a little bit from platform to platform, but generally what the platforms are talking about is that they're employing an agentic workflow where you have the query, you have a prompt that you're giving to the platform, and then it's working internally with a number of different steps, and it's working autonomously. Now, it does that. Most of them ask some questions first before it starts in on the actual work that it's doing, but it goes through a process by which it's not just encoding into tokens, recalling information from its training, and then translating it back into words for us, it's actually going through a number of steps. And this isn't always the same from platform to platform, but generally it works something like this. It would start with some question analysis. And this is where it's going through much the same as a regular chatbot would be, converting it into tokens, starting to think about context, thinking about an understanding of what it is that you're asking or you're prompting, and then putting that together into a bit of a plan. Then it moves into some research planning and it starts to really investigate the strategy with different search angles. Now, what you'll find with some of the platforms, and we'll look at these examples that'll demonstrate this, often they'll come back with some questions before they actually engage through with the work that the deep research tool is going to do. It'll ask you some questions about follow-up to understand maybe the audience or the scope of the work or some of the applications. And it really varies upon what it is that you're asking and maybe the strength of the prompt sometimes. I know sometimes if I don't have a very strong prompt, it'll have some more pointed questions about what it is that I'm asking it to do. But it's a good way for it to make sure that it's really focusing its attention on what it is that you're really asking for and to understand what it is that you're asking for. Because there's a lot of compute, a lot of energy that goes into completing a deep research a query and process. And so it's wanting to do that to make sure it's more efficient. Then it starts working through some iterative search. It conducts multiple targeted searches and it starts refining the approach based on findings. And you'll see that when we look at the kind of the chat log that it has as it's working through, you'll be able to see step by step how it starts to go through a bit of a search, getting the results, refining some of that research planning, thinking again about what it is the query that was being asked, how to figure out how to match that research strategy, and to be able to develop another search function so that it goes through that a number of times depending upon what it is that's being asked and the different components of the query. Then you get into some source evaluation. It starts to, and this is dependent largely upon the prompt, the query that you have. What is it that you're looking for, and in terms of the output that you're really looking for as well. But it varies a bit from platform to platform. But generally, if you give it guidance in terms of the types of sources, the level of credibility or relevance, this is where it will start to evaluate those sources to make sure that the materials that it's generating, that it's bringing back in to then generate the report, are meeting the expectations that you have within the query. Then it starts to synthesize. It puts this into some text. And this is very similar to that query that you would have of a regular chatbot, where it takes the tokens, starts to put them together in a way that meets the context, the research plan, the iterative search, and then it generates it in natural language. And then it also includes citations. And this is something that's a really important function within deep research, is that it is pulling in outside research. It's not just trying to recall from its own internal training. It's tied to a web search, to different functions of that web search. And so it'll give you the links so that you can go and find those sources on your own, and you can then refer to the citations. So what's important to remember about this is that it's going through a number of steps. It takes a good bit of time, depending upon the platform, what it is that you're asking of it. If you have Perplexity is generally pretty fast, even in this deep research mode, might take 2 or 3 minutes. If you have some of the other platforms, I've had some that'll take 10, 20, 30 minutes. I had Claude working on something the other day that took over an hour as it was evaluating. Now, I'm not sure that it really needed an hour for all of these steps. I'm also wondering if maybe they were overloaded in terms of what the data center was able to support. There are probably other factors there too, but it is important to remember that when you're doing a deep research query, that it is going to take some time because it's trying to generate better content to meet what it is that you're asking for. Now, what I've been really intrigued by is the way that we consider hallucinations. And this is a real concern, of course, with any AI tool that we're working with. It's not recalling information. And so if you're not really familiar with the way it's putting together the response to your query, it's not recalling something like asking Wikipedia, what's the answer to this question? And it's pulling it from that text and giving you that text as a response. It's not recalling it. It's generative AI. It's generating the text based on some of its training. And so it'll be in line with some of that trained information. But if it doesn't have specific information to draw from and it's not doing a web search, then it starts to make up content. And that's where the hallucinations really come from, especially with earlier versions that weren't tied to a web search. Now, that level of hallucination can vary, and it's not that the early ones were more likely to hallucinate than later ones. There were more recent models like 0103 that had high levels of hallucination, in part because they were trying to be more creative. And there are also ways, if you join me in 2 weeks when we talk about PlayLab, for instance, I'll show you that when you build your own bot, you can actually change that level of creativity. It's called the temperature or variability, and some platforms will refer to it, to talk about how closely you want it to hew to to specific text or how creative you want it to be in generating that content that you're asking for. So this is something that's really intriguing to me because the real concern is if you're going to be using it for research, you want to make sure that it's not hallucinating if at all possible. And how do you limit that? Part of this context, as I was thinking about this workshop, is to think about it in terms of comparing it to human error rates. And so I've been doing a little bit of reading, and I'm really just scratching the surface on this. And I think this is certainly worthy of further study. And maybe we'll be able to do something more on error rates and hallucinations, maybe next semester, which would be really interesting. But I found a lot of literature that talked about error assessment rates and error assessment techniques for human techniques and really human cognitive capabilities and actions. So if you take something that's like a simple rapid task, and even if it's interrupted, you might find maybe a 2% error rate for humans. If you have something really complex and there's no time for reflection, no time for thought, it might jump up quite a bit. Now, you'll see that there's the acronyms here, HEART, and I put on the bottom left, you can see it stands for Human Error Assessment and Reduction Technique. And there's some sources there, and I'll put the sources I'll share that as a Google Doc, or I'll share it with you via email so you can look at it. It's certainly worth looking into. I'm certainly not an expert in this literature, and it's something I'm just starting to explore. But it's interesting to see how over the last several decades, there's been a lot of research on this. When you think about people that are managing weapon systems or managing systems that have a lot of concern in terms of the outcome, if you think about financial databases or work processes, they're trying to minimize that human error rate. And so there's a lot of research about how that error rate occurs and what might help alleviate that. Now, if you get into something like manual data entry that's very routine, it drops down to like 1.1% to 4% is what they find, and it's kind of a nominal error probability. The technique for human error rate prediction found if you have something that's really a high cognitive load and there's a chance for procedural errors, then human error rate might be 10% plus. And if you think about safety incidents, think about an accident, if you're multitasking, if something's high stakes, then the accident rate or the error rate can be 60 to 80% when you're thinking about those accidents. Now, this is all over the map, and there's not a lot to take from this other than to kind of remind us that humans make mistakes too. And I know that when I'm doing my research, I have to be really careful about keeping track of citations or keeping track of lines of argument or fairly representing materials that I'm trying to represent within my research. And I just want this to help contextualize a little bit about one of the reasons why these types of tools, deep research tools, thinking models, were developed and how they're being applied. Now, this is just one data point, and this is just for one application for GPT-5, but this is something they came out with this summer talking about the error rate, responses with at least one error, the number of responses with at least one error. If you looked at some of their earlier models, o3 or GPT-4o, and those were still fairly new models in the end of 2024 through the beginning of 2025, those had error rates about 20 to 22% of responses had at least one error in them. Now, when they moved to GPT-5, they were really working on reducing hallucinations. So it's not even to say that all of the data had 20% of the data was error rate. It's that of 20% responses, there was some error within that response. So this is probably, even lower than what you would be thinking, but this is in terms of the response. GPT-5 without thinking is at 11% error rate and of those responses, and GPT-5 with thinking, which is employing this kind of agentic workflow where it takes longer, it's more reflective, it's an iterative search process, drops to about 4.8%. And for much of the work that we probably do, our students do, we're probably in that range in terms of the error rate. So I don't present this to say that there are no hallucinations. There are still hallucinations. We have to be very careful when we're looking at how the data is represented. But we are getting to the stage where the agentic workflow and the thinking models, where they're able to include kind of this iterative process where it's reconsidering material, recontextualizing it, thinking back and reflecting on the process, has gotten much better in terms of reducing that hallucination rate, that error rate with the output that you actually have. Now, when we think about different,
can I just ask a question?
Mhm.
I'm just trying to get my head around when you talk about an error, what kind of error it is. Is this like, oh, it missed a important research paper that it should have known about, or is this it misinterpreted what some of the
I
research had said, or like what is that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I want to put the caveat I'm not really steeped in the specific study, but my understanding of it is that that first example that you gave, like missing an important study, that wouldn't count because that's not really an error in terms of the error of the output. That's an error of omission. And I think there are people studying that, but I don't think that's what's represented here. I think this is only representing output that includes an error in terms of something that we typically call a hallucination, where it misrepresents something or maybe gives an incorrect citation. I've done deep research reports where I'll find that it has the correct name of the article, but it has the wrong link. And it maybe just makes an error in the link. And it's not even that the link is for something different. It just made an error in terms of how it transcribed it. That might be an error that would be represented here, or a data point that is misrepresentative of what it is that it's pulling it from. Now, when we think about different platforms and they all call their deep research tool as having different capabilities, it always reminded me of this Spider-Man meme. They're all kind of the same in terms of what they're trying to do. And the most common have been Gemini, OpenAI, and Perplexity. Now we also see that Claude has a research function and Microsoft's Copilot has added this as well. And when we think about some of those options, this is just presented as a bit of an overview that in terms of what the capabilities are, they're fairly similar. I'd say the biggest differences probably come between Perplexity and many of the others because the Perplexity deep research tends to be much faster. It's not quite as in-depth. And you can also have limited free access. So even with a free account, I believe you have to log in. You can create an account or you can use your Google sign in for a single sign in with Perplexity. But with the free access, you still get several of the deep research queries a day. With ChatGPT, it's the same thing. You have a free account. You can have access to GPT-5 thinking in a very limited way, but you do have some access to that. In Gemini, I believe that they've saved the deep research for paying subscriptions, the pro accounts. But it also, you'll find that a lot of students now have access to Gemini Pro. As college students, they're given a free account for the year if they sign up. And that gives them the full year of 2 terabytes of storage, as well as access to all of these tools. Claude is one that is limited. They don't allow the research unless you have the paid account. But the other one that I definitely wanted to highlight is Microsoft's Copilot. And this is a fairly new development. I'm not sure exactly when they added this research agent, but I'll show you where you can access it. And this is free for all UMW users. Now, I believe that others trying to access Copilot would not be able to access this. But because we're a UMW campus, we all have access to UMW's Copilot license. You should have access to the research agent. And it's relatively fast, but it's also very thorough. And I'll show you an example of a search that I did just earlier today on Copilot's research agent to kind of see how that works. So generally, these are fairly comparable. ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Copilot, very comparable in terms of the length, the kinds of content that's being generated. Perplexity, typically a little bit shorter, but much faster in terms of the results that it'll generate. And I'll be happy to share these slides with you too, if you'd like to be able to go back to look at some of this.
Hey, Anand,
Sure.
you may get into this in a little bit, but when I'm using GPT, how do I know if I'm submitting a prompt for deep research or just a standard type prompt?
That's an excellent question, Jeff. Thanks for that. I was actually just going to move to GPT because I wanted to talk about ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, and then say a little bit about Microsoft's research agent. This is a really good point that Jeff brings up. They used to include a button that you would find here in the query box where you could click deep research. They no longer have that available. And I think part of the reason they've done that is they've really folded that in to the GPT thinking model because the thinking model is very similar, if not exactly the same as what they were using before for deep research. It allows for that iterative processing. It takes longer. And I believe that the thinking access is available for free, but very limited access. And this is something they've changed a bit. So even if you're watching this recording a month from now, you might find that they've all changed what their access and usage levels might be. But if you're working with ChatGPT, I would say you click on thinking, it thinks longer for better answers. and it automatically incorporates web search, so it includes that in. So let me show you an example of one that I ran on ChatGPT, and I used the same prompt for each of these platforms so we can kind of compare the results. I've been working on an AI literacy course. I offered Intro to AI this past summer. I've been working on trying to develop a new model for it. So it's something that I'm fairly conversant with the literature. And I think that's important, especially for faculty and staff to be thinking about. I wouldn't want to just rely on a deep research report for something that I'm not already familiar with the literature. Now, I think the caveat to that might be using a deep research report to be able to get some base knowledge, but I would be far more critical then about what it is that I'm taking in and how would I verify some of that data. So I think it's a little different approach. For most of us, when we're thinking about running a deep research report, we're probably working on it in something in an area in a literature that we're fairly familiar with. And that's helpful because then we have an easy way to be able to verify some of the content that's coming out of it. Not to say that it's not going to come up with something new or novel in terms of its approach or new materials. I would hope that it would. But I have a better chance of telling whether or not it's kind of in line with what I would expect. So in this case, what I did is that I asked it to help me develop an AI literacy course for undergraduates, one credit course. I asked it to do several things, and I like to have it include a number of content of items that it's going to be generating into work on. In part because I typically am not going to go do a deep research query unless I already have something really fairly specific in mind. If I'm just trying to do a search on trying to understand something, some background information, I don't want to waste that much compute on it for me just to get an easy answer. If it's just something you just want to get some basic, easy background information, I might just go to Wikipedia or look for a Google search because it's not going to use as much compute. A little bit more responsible use of the compute power. And I also don't need to spend that much time on it. I just want to be able to get some easier answers. So deep research certainly does not take the place of a basic query on a chatbot. But when I am using deep research, it's when I've had a project in mind, I'm working on something, I already have some output in mind that I like it to generate. And so I'll give it several things that I like it to work on. I asked it to first find articles about other AI literacy courses. I wanted to research the components of an AI literacy course, what should it include. I wanted to develop a schedule for a course, a 15-week semester, recommend assignments, and also outline concerns about what might be missing or what support would be necessary to offer the course. Um, again, another caveat is I would never want to take this and think that this is going to generate what you would use as the final output or the final content. But it could help you jump up that learning level a little bit and maybe it'll generate some good ideas. So in this case, it only thought for 1 minute and 7 seconds. It did not take it long, and it came up with a number of articles, several of them that I've seen before and I would expect to see talking about AI literacy. It talked about what an AI literacy course should include. And in this case, it didn't really put it as a lengthy, wordy report as much as links with some, kind of an annotated bibliography almost, just to say, here's some content. You can find it on this link, and then I can click on any of them and find those sources. It gave me a 15-week plan for a one credit course, outlining different contexts, different topics that I would talk about. It gave me some different assignment ideas and then talked about some risks, gaps, and supports needed. Now, what I would say about ChatGPT's GPT-5 thinking mode is that, and I've read this, you sometimes can't really tell what the output is going to be. You have to be a little more specific, saying exactly what you're looking for. If you're looking for a narrative, if you're looking for a report, you really have to specify that. I've also heard that some users have found that when they use GPT-5 thinking and they're assuming that it's maybe because the servers are overloaded. There are a lot of queries going on at the same time that they're getting shorter responses, and maybe it's not spending as much time as they might like. And this is one of the hazards of them taking away the button that says deep research. It's just GPT-5 thinking, and it has a built-in router that kind of assumes, okay, how far in depth should we go with this, but depending upon what's asked for and what the capabilities are of the platform. So that gives you a sense of what GPT-5 is able to do. Let me show you what Claude did, and I gave it exactly the same prompt, just copied it in, and it asked me a series of questions. It said, before diving into the research, let me ask some clarifying questions. Who's the intended audience for the course? And it goes in more detail. Are there any constraints on the course format? Any particular aspects of AI literacy you want to emphasize? And so I gave quick answers, and then it worked on this, and it took it said 6 minutes and 7 seconds. And if I click on this, you can see what it went through. It generated a research plan, and it outlined exactly what it was doing each step of the way. It gathered 356 sources, so you can see what sources it was going through, and I can click on each one to see those sources and click on the links and click through. Then it also, let me go back to this. Yeah, then it generated the research report. And when I look at the research report, it developed this document, and it's a pretty lengthy document. You know, it goes through and talks about what other schools are doing, essential components for literacy. Definitely more in depth, I think, than the GPT-5 report. It talks about a schedule framework, hour breakdown, detailed weekly breakdown with some ideas for activities for some of the weeks, time distribution per week, assignment recommendations. Now, I was trying to generate something and use an idea that might be, you know, to help you illustrate, to illustrate to you some of the capabilities. So I don't know that I would necessarily give it all of these tasks, but I wanted to see what it was able to do in thinking mode to develop some of this. And it had a lot of different ideas and some really good ideas for different assignments or activities I might use in the class. How to preventing AI misuse while teaching it, peer interaction, and then implementation concerns. You can see it's very lengthy. And what's also kind of nice about the Claude model, I really like the way it writes. It tends to have a very good, thorough, approach to its search. I like that its writing style generally it works well. I could also publish this, and then it becomes what they call an artifact, and it's really just a web page that I can share with others. So if you have a document like this, you can publish it, share it with students or with colleagues, and they'll be able to access this. And very quickly looking at what Perplexity generated, and Perplexity, it took less than a minute, and it was able to generate a good bit of content for each one. Again, you can see the sources that it was looking at. I can click on any of them, gives me the outline, recommended assignments and activities, and so forth. And so that was actually pretty good, and it gives a pretty thorough response. Not quite as in depth as Claude or some of the others, but still very useful. Now, Microsoft Copilot is one that I haven't used a lot in the past, to be honest, because it tended to give very similar types of responses to ChatGPT, but it tended to be somewhat held back. It was a little bit restrained. They didn't include many of the same features as OpenAI did on ChatGPT. I think that's changing. If you follow any of the news between the drama between Microsoft and OpenAI, that we're seeing the Microsoft is trying to develop some of those same capabilities because they now have to see OpenAI as a competitor and not just a collaborator. And so they're starting to incorporate more of these tools. If you just go to copilot.microsoft.com, I'm going to put this in the chat so you can play around with this yourself, and you can log in with your UMW account, and then you have access to a number of things that are really helpful. You can do just a regular search and use it just like you were able to use it before, and you can do a web search with AI capabilities. And that's an example of something that I did here. I just did a search with the same query, the same question, and asked it to develop a response. And it looks kind of similar to what Perplexity did. It's not too in-depth, maybe not as in-depth as Perplexity, but it came up with a pretty good answer. Now, what I did for a second search is that I used up here, they have agents and researcher. And this is a fairly new development. And let me show you what it came up with. When I asked it, it had some questions to clarify the search before it completed the search, similar to what we found with Claude. Is it fully online? Designed for general undergraduates, specific majors? Is it hands-on use of tools? Should the assignments be low stakes, looking for models from liberal arts institutions or any college level AI literacy course? And then I answered some of those questions, and then it started to work. And you can look through here, and we'll be able to see that you can see the quote unquote thought process, the reflection process that it went through, similar to what Claude was able to do. So it starts research, it starts crafting the course, mapping the course, crafting search queries. Remember back to that slide where I was showing that process. It's going through an iterative process where it starts to understand the context. It starts to think about the searches that it needs to conduct to be able to better answer some of those ideas. And then it keeps coming back to that and going back and forth so that it starts thinking about AI literacy. It identifies more sources. It identifies some other courses. It maps AI courses, checking credentials, examining AI in education, and then crafting some of this content. You'll see it just continues. This took longer than any of the other platforms, and I think it came up with some really excellent results. And I was really impressed with it, actually. Now, it developed this report, and it's a very lengthy report. You can see could scroll quite a ways, and it includes a number of items, including even it's going to include some code previews, and that's kind of similar to what Claude does with artifacts. But it includes, for most, yeah, all of them footnotes, so I can click through and see any of the materials that it's citing. And so pretty thorough search. Now, one thing I forgot to mention that I found in the other search that I did on Copilot, since I signed in as with my UMW account, and I was asking it to do this search, it also did a search within internal documents. And so if you have anything in your OneDrive or anything that's shared with you in OneDrive, it will search those items first. And so when I asked about AI literacy courses, it first found these documents that I had and that I had in the OneDrive. Now, a lot of my stuff, I actually work in Google Drive. You can do this, a similar type of search, and work with materials on Claude and with ChatGPT, with Google Drive materials, and with OneDrive. Since we have Microsoft Copilot, it starts with this. And so I was pleasantly surprised. It found some of the documents that I had in my proposal to establish the Center for AI and the Liberal Arts at UMW, a program analysis for my department, an AI literacy model I worked on with the Oxford University Press. These were all drawing from my materials, highlighting them first, and then it went through external programs and looked at those materials too.
Yeah, Nod, can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, please do, Jeff.
One of the things that I have observed when I've been using GPT for things like this, not the deep research version, but just the sort of the garden variety GPT, what will happen is I will start a prompt, it go down, it responds and so forth, and I will get into these rabbit holes where GPT starts coming back with, and this could be, you know, what you mentioned before. It could be, well, whatever. I won't repeat it, but and when I look at what you're doing here with the deep research versions of these tools, it seems to be avoiding that by asking you for further input. And I'm wondering if that process of sort of discerning what you're trying to ask and coming back with questions and so forth, if that is something that can avoid these sorts of rabbit hole problems I'd have where GPT would sort of go off in a direction that was not helpful and I'd have to sort of pull it back in.
I've had those experiences too, Jeff. And I think it's not just ChatGPT. I've had that happen on other platforms. There are a couple of thoughts that I have about this. I think first, the deep research practice of asking those clarifying questions, and I think it does that to produce better output, but also because it's about conserving compute. I'm sure they probably had examples of people putting in a query, it going through for 15, 20 minutes and producing something using a lot of data power, and then the person saying, no, that's not what I was looking for. I actually wanted this instead. And so I think that probably drove part of it in terms of the user experience, user interface. I think it does help address that. That's been my experience. It's better. Well, I guess there are two parts of this. It's gotten better because it asks those clarifying questions. I think that interaction with the bot has also gotten me to produce better prompts. And I've become better at generating that prompt. One thing I didn't include here, but I probably should have, is that there have been a couple of times that I've been working on using deep research to do a very specific task, something that's very in depth. And I've worked for a while to get the right prompt because I'll find the prompt will result in varied output depending upon how good the prompt really is. There have been a number of times that I will work with a regular chatbot, not in deep research mode, but just to ask for help with developing the prompt. So there was one report, for instance, I was working with, and I was getting ready for a presentation to the foundation. I thought it would be really useful if they used deep research to be able to research prospective donors. And I found that we could develop a prompt that was very thorough and would generate a lot of content, a lot of information, all from public records that would help them understand this prospective donor better. I spent a lot of time developing that prompt. And what I ultimately did is I went to ChatGPT, outlined exactly what it is that I wanted that output to look like, and said, help me generate a prompt that would help produce that. The prompt ended up being about 300 words long. So not terribly long, but full page that I would be able to use and I would tailor in certain instances. And that seemed to do the trick. So I've gotten better at prompt writing. It's gotten better at asking clarifying questions. And for me, in those instances, Jeff, I agree with you. It has definitely reduced those weird tangents and rabbit holes where it goes off in other directions. The other aspect of this that is probably worth exploring a little further, a little later, because it's still a fairly new development on some of these platforms. If you have an account and you sign in and it knows it's me, for instance, on ChatGPT, they've started adding memory. And when they started adding this originally, it was a little bit unnerving, to be honest, because you weren't really sure, well, why does it remember that about me? And I remember seeing people even saying, why don't you test it and ask ChatGPT to produce a picture of you based on what it knows about you? And it was kind of uncanny. Now, the picture that I asked it to generate, it didn't produce a picture that looked like me, but it certainly put me in a classroom on campus. It showed elements of the University of Mary Washington. It included reports on my desk that were based on projects I'd been working on. So it was retaining a lot of memory about me. What I found is the memory function is also helping to solve this because I think that it understands and it works with that context and it kind of knows what I've been working on, projects that I've been asking for feedback on, and that helps tailor it. And so I think that's something to explore and to see how well that works. Now, my concern is sometimes I don't want it to be based on the past knowledge or memory of me or the other work I've done. I want a new, fresh take on this. And so that's certainly something that we should try to research as well. Thanks for that. Does that help answer what you were thinking about, Jeff?
Yeah, it did. Thank you, Anand.
Excellent. Thanks. So when we look at this, I think Microsoft Copilot's researcher agent was really quite effective and it worked really well. And this is something I would encourage you to play around with. And what I thought we might want to do, and I've talked about some of these, I thought it might be useful for us to spend a few minutes having you try one of these research queries, try a prompt in research mode. And if you want to use Copilot, or if you don't have one of the other paid accounts, then I would recommend using either Perplexity, because it's pretty easy to get a free search, or try Copilot. And what I'd like you to do is to come up with a prompt related to a course that you plan to teach in the spring. And maybe it's to help you generate an assignment, or maybe to give you some feedback about new literature that you might want to include in your course, just something related to a course, and try it out on one of these platforms. And then give us come back and we'll talk about this in a few minutes to see how that response maybe differed from what you found in other searches. And if you want to do this fairly quickly, you could probably open two tabs, both of them Copilot, try one with just a basic search and the other one using the researcher agent, and then compare the results and see what you come up with. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those results. Does that sound good to everybody? Let me give you the link. You have the link to Copilot in the chat. I'll also put the link to Perplexity because that's one that you should be able to access fairly easily. And I believe you can just do a free search. Not certain if you have to log in or not, but if you do, you just log in probably with your Gmail account and you'll be able to access it. But let's take just a few minutes, try that out, and then let's come back and talk a bit about what you came up with. Again, I wanted to talk about another application with deep research that I find really useful when we consider that deep research as a function on an AI platform is really just the use of deploying a thinking model, which is often really just the same AI platform, the same AI large language model, but it's being deployed in different ways, where it has that process by which it has iterative search, it has reflection, it starts to really consider a broader strategy, and it takes more time. It's not only useful for generating a research report, and often when we think of deep research, we only think about it in terms of conducting research and bringing back a final report. But that thought process, that thinking model is also useful to get the AI platform to reflect on maybe content that you're uploading or that you're sharing. So let me share an example with you that I had that I took I used researcher again. In this case, what I did is I took a book proposal that I was working on. I'm working on the book now. I took the chapter draft that I had submitted to the publisher last fall. And this is a book on AI pluralism and safety alignment issues. And so it's a little bit out of date at this point. And so part of this was kind of to test to see how it would work. I'm using the researcher mode, but I'm not really asking it to do more research. Part of it will be, but most of it is that I give it the role of serving as an editor and academic publisher. Submitting this for consideration. I want careful review of the draft to provide detailed and highly critical feedback, including strengths, weaknesses, evaluation of research included, evaluation of writing style, how this chapter meets the needs of researchers, and then provide specific feedback about how to improve the draft. I've used this a number of times before, and I found it to be incredibly useful. The thinking model is able to give much better feedback and to be able to go through line by line, if you ask it to be able to help you improve the content of what it is that you're working on, whether it's the content itself or the writing style. It works really well. So when I did this, it had some questions. It asked about the book that this was part of a proposal for, asked about the focus on theoretical rigor, alignment, practical applicability, particular audiences. Do you want the feedback to include suggestions for additional sources or recent research that would strengthen the chapter? Which I was glad it included that because, as I mentioned, this was a somewhat dated chapter draft that I wrote last fall, and there's been a lot more written about safety alignment and related issues with contestability and explainability. So I gave some answers to it, and then it started to work through, and you can see again a long process by which it went through different elements of what it was I was asking it to do, and then it gave me this critical editorial review. I copied it and put it into a Google Doc so you can see it was about 9,000 words that it generated, where it looked at the strengths of the chapter. I'm glad that there were some weaknesses and areas of improvement, evaluation of research, content, and currency, and it really called me out on a number of the research not research studies and the publications not being current enough, which I was glad to see. It talked about writing style and clarity, audience appropriateness and alignment, recommendations for improvement. And then I went through in some detail about how to improve and update this document if I was planning on submitting it. So this was, I think, a fairly novel use of it. And I think you can start to consider really other applications where you take the thinking model and you get it to apply to something that you're working on. You can upload documents, and it's as easy as clicking on add content. And within the add content on Copilot, you can include all the materials you might have in your OneDrive. You can upload materials to your OneDrive. You could also have it search your emails or look through particular emails or websites. And there's a lot of material there that you can draw from and have it deploy this thinking model to be able to do something a little more in depth than you might be able to receive if you just put it into a regular chatbot. Um, any questions or comments about that and thinking about that type of application?
So I had one question. The databases that we use through the library, many of them, they cannot access those, right? That's paid still, so we need to
Correct.
actually continue doing our research in that way. But this is only web research when it does citations.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I changed the screen because that's a very excellent point. Their access constraints are a really important limitation. It will not penetrate. And this is part of the copyright concern as well, is that there have been instances where sometimes these research tools are getting around paywalls, and I think they're tightening that up. So they are not going to be able to get through paywall databases, accessing those or institutional repositories, with the caveat of Copilot being able to access materials we have internally. So that's important for students to know that. It's not going to give you access to some of the best peer-reviewed research if it can't access a particular database. And so that'll be important for them to do that research on their own. Now, you could also find some of those articles, and if you have them as PDFs and you want to be able to incorporate it, you can upload those files to have it give you feedback about that file, to be able to incorporate it, to give you analysis of it. And that's one workaround, but that is a real limitation that you would have. Other questions or comments?
You did finally get an output, Anand, and it's very good.
Oh, good, 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 good.
But I
So,
don't know if I was still not able to answer the questions that it put to me.
hmm.
So I'll figure that out.
Okay. I think sometimes when they ask the questions, you can simply say, just go ahead without answering them, and it'll go ahead and work on it. And
I think
maybe in
that's
that
what
case,
it
it just
did.
did. Yeah.
And what about data? If we feed the data into the chatbot, will it attempt to do the analyses? And if we designate what analysis we want, like would it apply structural equation modeling, let's say, to a model that I feed to it?
Potentially. So there are some examples where some of the platforms are better at that than others. And you can upload even a spreadsheet, or you can upload material and data and have it, especially in thinking mode, it tends to work better at this. Give it very specific instructions about the type of analysis you'd like it to conduct. And some of the platforms are better than others, but typically they'll be able to provide some of that analysis. And so I was able to use that with an anonymous survey data, and it was able to generate, and that's pretty superficial. That's pretty basic, easy stuff, but it worked on it very well. It was able to process that information and offer some analysis of it. So you can upload a spreadsheet, you can upload that data. I found that Claude is particularly good at that, and Claude produces these artifacts. It actually produces the code to generate an interactive infographic, for instance, or the code to be able to run an app. I'm going to run a session a little later in the term on vibe coding to think about how you can get it to generate code in different ways. I think that's a great application of it, where you can get it to generate code to represent data sets, so you can better interact with it. And that, I think you could probably come up with some really novel ways of then taking data sets and making them more accessible to students by generating an easy app. So Claude is
You.
very good at that. I think the other thing I should mention is that Microsoft Copilot, because we have it as part of our institutional license, there are additional protections there and security protections for that data. It's not being trained upon, it's being kept within our OneDrive. So in the same way that it's a secure database, a repository, not database, a repository of our data for OneDrive, it's similarly secure when you're using Copilot with that, as long as you're logged in with your UMW account. Other platforms can offer those securities as well. It depends on whether or not you have a paid account or if you turn off their ability to train off of data or what they're able to use with it. Well, we have just a few minutes left, and I appreciate you all being here and sticking around for so long. I wanted to highlight just a few of the strengths and limitations. I think you'll find when you're playing around with it, there's some really comprehensive coverage, some fairly consistent quality, at least certainly more consistent than with the general chatbot because of that thinking model being deployed. And it can make it more efficient. You can really get through a lot more research, and you can do some really interesting things with it, especially if you leave it alone and come back to it. Very important limitations. As we mentioned, the access constraints listed there. It's also really important to still verify, even though the error rate is much lower and there are fewer hallucinations, they still occur. I certainly wouldn't want anybody to be in a situation where they're taking the output and then assuming that it's correct and then deploying it or sharing it elsewhere. This is just a good element of that process to be able to get some content that you can then review and verify in different ways. And I think the models will continue to get better at reducing those error rates and be able to find ways to verify and tools to verify. And there's some gaps. It might miss some other disciplinary arguments or other theoretical frameworks. I would definitely encourage colleagues to work in areas where you can verify a lot of this content and use it as a way to really just supplement, to augment your expertise, certainly not to replace it. And I wouldn't want to use it in place of doing some of the initial background reading or learning that I'd want to do on my own. Uh, I think we'll do more in upcoming workshops about maybe better prompting and leveling up research queries. Given the time, I wanted to make sure that I just get to some final remarks. When we think about deep research and thinking tools, you'll find they're really powerful. They still make mistakes. And I think of it as a good, helpful starting point, and to be able to then verify that content, to be able to work through it. And you'll find the results are going to vary by platform. But I also would encourage you to remember that it requires a lot of compute. And so when we're considering the environmental impacts of use of AI, that it's not to say that you shouldn't be using deep research, but I wouldn't just use it indiscriminately when I could just do a simple search with something else, or an easier interaction on a chatbot. I don't need to tie up that much compute for it to spend 5 minutes considering something that I could get an easy answer for instance. And I think the more we ask for transparency from these companies, the better they will be about limiting that compute power and the environmental impacts. Please, I would love it if you could join me for other AI tool webinars coming up. The end of September, I'll have one on PlayLab. If you haven't played around with PlayLab, it's a nonprofit ed tech platform that is excellent for building your own bots. And you can teach students to be able to build their own bots, no code bot creator and tool creator. And it's something that I can give you access to and be able to show you how to build those bots and be able to use this in class. I find it to be a really excellent tool. Then talk about Notebook LM in the middle of October, then creating GPTs and gems, GPTs for ChatGPT or gems, and as you would use for Gemini, Google's Gemini. And then finally, in November, getting into some vibe coding and to talk a little bit about using some of the tools for a no code coding application and some interesting ways you might be able to incorporate that into your classes. I will keep the website for the Center of AI and the Liberal Arts updated with updates on the timing, access to any of these, as well as other upcoming events. Thank you so much for joining me today. Those of you that were watching live and those that are watching it, please feel free to reach out with any questions or suggestions for other events and webinars you'd like to see us offer.